Hi everyone. So very nice to be back in Suffolk. So I was talking to Jane and I said I thought we were here about 4 years ago, and Jane reliably told me it was 9 years ago, which explains why I'm feeling old. So I'm going to try and quite quickly give you an overview of some work that we recently did. Can I get a 5-minute shout when I have 5 minutes left? Yeah? Because I tend to talk for a long time. So this report was The Colour of Injustice. The background to the report will become clear through the presentation. So I think we're coming to the end of a phase of stop and search reform, and that phase really began with the English riots in 2011. And one of the key responses to that was the HMIC report. So Theresa May commissioned the HMIC to do a report into how was stop and search being used. And what the HMIC report really did for those of us who've been working in the field for many years, showed what we thought we already knew. Showed that there were systemic failings within the regulatory mechanisms which were supposed to be in place to ensure that stop and search was being used in ways which were fair and effective. That police forces were systematically failing to put in place and carry out the things that they should have been carrying out according to statutory provision. Okay? Cool. And really important to note that this effort and the reform effort that followed was fundamentally tied to concerns about race and racism. So this is from the House of Commons debate, and it was a quite extraordinary debate where you had Conservative politicians competing with one another to say how racist the police were and how bad racism is. Okay? Now I'm putting this up not to shame police, because I don't think there's much value in doing that. It's not productive. I'm putting this up because it's important for us to know and understand that this is what the reforms were about. This is what they were rooted in. Although the expression is clumsy in many ways, this is the basis of what it was about. And secondly, it highlights the point of how the experience of race and racism in the context of policing undermines the legitimacy of the police, even within the House of Commons, even within MPs. So these are not people that have lived this experience. So even amongst elected representatives who are about as distant from this lived experience as it's possible to be, will lose faith in the police when they hear these kinds of stories. So Theresa May, nobody wins when stop and search is misapplied, is a waste of police time, it is unfair, especially to young black men, it's bad for public confidence in the police. Michael Lewis, figures are a stain on British policing, it's disgraceful. Mrs May, yes, absolutely disgraceful. Richard Fuller, the misuse of stop and search is probably the worst form of legal racial abuse in our country. Okay? So these are the statements that will be made in the House of Commons about why we needed to reform stop and search. And a package of reform was introduced. One of the things to notice about the package of reform is hardly any of it is specifically to do with race. The one thing that was to do with race was implicit bias, and it was training. Training is really at the lowest, the bottom end of the regulatory pyramid. It's the softest, gentlest form of regulation that we can do. And so this really was an attempt at persuasion. There was very little force in this regulation, so the best use of stop and search scheme is a voluntary scheme that police may or may not be part of. And I was very sceptical about it, and I have to say it's had much more impact than I ever imagined that it would have. So we have seen real improvements in the use of stop and search. So the evidence consistently shows us that the police are much more careful, much more considered in their use of the powers. So we've seen a big reduction in the number of grounds which do not meet the threshold of being reasonable. So as assessed by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, the percentage of stop and search records that they look at where reasonable grounds have not been established has fallen from over a quarter, so over 1 in 4, where the legal threshold had not been met, has fallen down to 6%. So big improvements in police practice and articulation of grounds. What we've also seen is a huge reduction in the numbers of stop searches. So we've seen something like a 72% reduction in the amount of stop and search since 2010 and 11. Alongside that, we've seen a doubling of the percentage of stop and searches that end in arrest. So these indicators, better grounds, less stop and search, higher arrest rate, all points in the direction of a much more considered, much more careful use of the powers. Absolute positive outcomes. But we have some enduring problems. So one of the things that the HMIC highlighted was the large amount of stop and search that was for low-level drug possession offences, which are not part of local crime plans. And so this is really an extensive use of police power for something that is not considered to be a police priority locally. What we've seen actually is the percentage of stop and search that is for drugs has increased. And we estimate that about between a third and 40% of all stop and search is for cannabis possession. Okay? And now we're at a point where over 60% of stop and search nationally is for drugs. And most of that is going to be for low-level cannabis possession. So the focus has not shifted towards, towards weapons. Still remains about the case that about 10%, 11% of stop and search is for weapons. Much greater amount for drugs, the vast majority of which is low-level possession offences. What we also have seen, and bear in mind the emphasis that was put on race and discrimination at the outset, this is what the reforms were primarily rooted in, this was the concern. So this figure here is the rate at which black people are stop and search relative to white. So if you look in 2010, it was 6 times. We initially saw a reduction, and that was because it was the big London, West Midlands forces that made the initial reductions, but since then we've seen an increase in disproportionality. So over the duration where we've seen the implementation of reforms which were rooted in a concern because of discriminatory policing, what we've seen is that policing has become more discriminatory. So the core issue that the reforms were designed to address has not been improved, has not been eliminated. And there's also another emerging problem that we see from the data. For years, the problem around stop and search has been restricted to who is it that gets the initial stop and search. If you look at the arrest rate from stop and search, it was pretty much the same for all ethnic groups for years. That's now no longer the case. It's now the arrest rate is higher for black people than it is for white people. That's not because they're found to be in possession of prohibited articles more often. The detection rate is pretty much the same regardless of ethnic groups. The difference is the outcome is different. So you'll see here that the arrest rate for black people is higher than for white people, 22% compared with 16%. But the out-of-court disposal rate for black people is lower than for white people, 9% compared to 11%. The key thing is the gap here. So black people are more than twice as likely to get arrested than to receive an out-of-court disposal, whereas for white people it's 16% compared to 11%. So differential outcomes. Now, I don't believe that suddenly the police have become more discriminatory. I believe that this is a systems effect. And I believe what's driving this to a large extent is feedback loops. So one of the things around out-of-court disposals is you can only receive them once or twice. Cannabis warnings, you can receive one cannabis warning, then it escalates, you get an arrest. If communities are policed differently, and I think what we've seen as a result of these reforms is that the difference in the way in which different communities are policed has become more extreme. So leafy, suburban, largely white areas get response policing. Poorer, more diverse, inner city areas get proactive policing. Proactive policing is driving drug policing. If you're in one of those inner city, more diverse, poorer areas, much heavier policing presence, you're quickly going to exhaust the extent to which you can get out-of-court disposals. So, and we've spoken to police and they say this is absolutely the case, that you will stop and search someone, find them in possession of cannabis, you don't want to arrest, you think an arrest is utterly disproportionate, you want to issue a warning, do a P&D check, already had a cannabis warning, no option, got to arrest. So I think this is a policy issue, this is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed at the level of policy. And I would say we absolutely need to review the idea that cannabis warnings can only be given once, because it's absolutely driving discrimination within the criminal justice system. So because now the arrest rate is higher, disproportionality for arrest as a result of stop and search is higher than disproportionality for stop and search itself. So in terms of people getting arrested as a result of stop and search, the rate for black people is 12 times higher than the rate of white people. Statistics, and this is a key one because it kind of takes account of criminal behaviour. If we look at the percentage of all arrests within ethnic groups that are the result of stop and search, 17% of all black arrests are the result of stop and search, compared with 5% for white people. So that we can see that stop and search is driving criminalisation, particularly of black communities. Thank you very much. Now this statistic blows my mind. These are just a number, raw number, haven't played with the data, done anything fancy. The number of arrests for drug offences by ethnic group. Bear in mind, between 2010 and 11 and 2016-17, we saw a 72% reduction in the amount of stop and search. What do you see for the number of arrests of white people for drug offences? What do you see? The blue line, what happens? It's fallen quite sharply. This brown one, arrests of black people for drug offences. What do you see? It changed by one. One more person, black person, was arrested for drugs in 2016-17 than in 2010-11 in the context of a 72% reduction of stop and search. What this tells me is the police see arresting black people for drugs as their core business. Because if you're told that you need to reduce something by 72%, what do? You go back to core business. And this is absolutely driving discriminatory outcomes throughout the criminal justice system. This is the first time we've been able to disaggregate cannabis possession at court. And this is not as a result of stop and search. This is all prosecutions and convictions at court in England and Wales, 2017. And what we see is black people more than 11 and 12 times being prosecuted and convicted for cannabis possession at 11 to 12 times the rate of white people. We know from self-report surveys that black people use cannabis at a lower rate. So this is absolute prima facie discrimination. Not saying it's being driven by individual prejudice amongst police officers, not saying it's solely being driven by policing, but policing is absolutely at the heart of this. And I said we're coming to the end of a particular phase, and I got involved in this area of work just after the Lawrence inquiry. And what we had at the time was a lot of resistance and a lot of pushback to the reform agenda around the Lawrence inquiry, and we're really right back there now. So what we see is the talk around knife and gun violence. We need stop and search. This one particularly gets me. This is Cressida Dick. Absolute lack of police leadership on this issue. The police are afraid of racism complaints if they use their stop and search powers. The police are not the victims in this situation. And to suggest that police are afraid of using their powers for fear of being accused of racism, where disproportionality is at its highest rate since records have begun, is mind-boggling. It shows such an unwillingness to get to grips with the issue. And this was the conclusion of the report. So the report was really trying to reality test some of the claims around county lines, knife crime, gangs, modern slavery. The evidence presented in this report provides an important corrective to the defensive rhetoric that is developed in response to the reform of stop and search. This rhetoric pivots around claims that police are afraid of using their stop and search powers in case they are accused of racism, that ethnic disparities are a myth, and that stop and search is a vital tool in the fight against knife crime. None of these claims stand up to empirical scrutiny. While police narratives about stop and search revolve around knives, gangs, organised crime groups, drug supply, county lines and modern slavery, our analysis tells a different story. One of deprived, minority communities being over-policed and selectively criminalised for minor drug possession offences that are largely ignored in other contexts and for other groups. So what we have is talk about knife crime, talk about violence, which is undoubtedly an issue, being used to justify the over-policing of communities for low-level drug possession offences. And that's what really needs to change. Where does Suffolk fit in this? And I know I'm quite short of time. The timings are slightly different, and I could only look at a limited number of indicators. Broadly speaking, Suffolk is part of the national picture. So overall rate of use of stop and search, lower in Suffolk than in much of the rest of the country, somewhat lower than average. Big reductions, so down 69% since the peak in 2008-9. Percentage of stop and search that is for drugs, part of that trend of increased focus on drugs, so it's gone up from 57% in 2006-7, this is of stop and search, to 70% for 2016-17, so 70% of stop and search in Suffolk in 2016-17 was for drugs. I would suspect if it's in line with national trends, the majority of that is for cannabis possession. Resulting arrests, improvement up from 7.3% to 15.3%, disproportionality. And there's something kind of staggering in this. So in 2016-17, Suffolk had the second highest rate of disproportionality of any police force in the country. That's somewhat lower now, it's gone down to being 6th. But we don't have to look very far to go back to a period where disproportionality was below 2. This would have been one of the lowest rates of disproportionality in the country. So the question for Suffolk is what's happened? What's happened for you to go from a situation in which, yeah, there's disproportionality, but it's below 2, to a situation when your disproportionality is getting up to, well, double figures? What's happened? What's changed? What's going on? And that's it. Thank you very much.